So we have another presentation in our We're Separate Because series, and this time we're looking at the topic of worship. We're separate because we understand the principle of worship. I expect if you've ever heard anyone speak on the subject of worship before, they've probably focused in on one of these topics or something like this: the preaching, the singing, the songs, the music. Perhaps there's been some debate over the kind of music you should have, prayer, how important that is as part of worship, and the reading of the Bible. These are all important, and the reason I've chosen the graphic I have here is that these should work together as a kind of corporate machine to produce a sensation and an experience of worship. But in this presentation we're going to look at something a little bit different. We're going to look at the book of Daniel, and rather than examining the many signs and symbols or the time periods or the mystical beasts that are mentioned there, we're going to have a look at the book of Daniel from the point of view of the theme of worship which runs throughout the book. So first of all, some background. About 900 years before the events that Daniel's writings record, God had brought the nation of Israel out of Egypt. They'd been slaves there for hundreds of years. God worked many miracles, brought them out of the land of Egypt, and gathered them together at the foot of Mount Sinai, where he proposed a deal. Now, in biblical terms, that's called a covenant. But the deal was quite simple. God said, listen, all I need you to do is worship me, not make any idols, not bow down to them, don't worship any other gods, just worship me. Oh, and by the way, be nice to each other. There are some rules to do with that, which of course is the Ten Commandments and everything. In return, God said, I will be your God. I'll look after you, I'll keep your enemies away from you, I'll make sure your harvests are plentiful, and so on. And the people thought this was a great idea. And for a little while, it was. But then things started to go wrong. And what happened was simply this. The people would worship God, God would look after them, they would then prosper. And as soon as they began to prosper, they began to forget about worshipping God, and they went off and they chased after the gods of the pagan nations around them, some of which we'll look at in just a moment. And when they had broken the deal with God, God said, well, look, you've broken this deal with me, so I'm going to leave you to your own devices. Whereupon disaster overtook them. And sometimes it was famine, sometimes it was drought, sometimes it was plagues. Most often it was their enemies coming in and attacking them. And sooner or later, at the very bottom of this cycle, Israel would wake up and say, hang on, weren't we better off when we were worshipping God? And of course the answer was yes, you were. And so there would be a great time of repentance, and they'd go back to worshipping God, and everything would be wonderful for a few years, maybe a decade or so. And then they would begin to prosper, and the whole miserable cycle would commence and repeat itself all over again. So they went through years and years of worshipping these pagan gods. Ashtoreth, a fertility goddess, the worship of which required ritual prostitution. You can see how that could be quite attractive to a certain kind of person. Baal, who apparently controlled the weather, though God rather showed him up with Elijah as the prophet. That's another story. An Asherah pole, and of course Molech. Do not think for 1 minute that these pagan gods were either any good, really, or that they were benign. They were far from that. The worship of them was depraved and wicked in the extreme, and child sacrifice was a part of that worship. And so finally, after any number of cycles, in 605 BC, God said, look, enough is enough. And he sent Nebuchadnezzar to besiege Jerusalem, to destroy it, to take the people away into captivity, into exile in Babylon. And his decree was simply this: for 70 years, the land is going to enjoy respite from the wickedness of the people. Now that's the background to the story of Daniel. But before we get into looking through chapter by chapter, we need to pick out our cast of characters, 4 young men: Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, had a very, very cunning strategy. Wherever he went, into any nation he conquered, he brought back the very best, most intelligent, best educated young men, and he enrolled them in the University of Babylon in order to study the language and literature. The idea was that the university would change the way they thought. He then picked the very best of the best to be advisors to him in his court. His idea was simple. He realized that the people we surround ourselves with change us. So, by surrounding himself with the very best and brightest, the most intelligent, the best educated, Nebuchadnezzar hoped it would make him wise, and it certainly seems a successful strategy. So these 4 young men are the key characters in the book of Daniel. So we're going to go through the book of Daniel chapter by chapter, looking at this theme of worship. Now, because our time is short, we're not going to deal with every chapter in a great deal of detail. However, these first 6 chapters we're going to look at are narrative. They're stories. They're quite interesting stories, really. So if there's something I skip over and you'd like to know more about it, please do in your own time. Pick up your Bible and read these chapters through. Please don't be put off. There's nothing in these that's difficult to interpret. They're self-explanatory. Very easy reading. It's only later on that things get a little bit mysterious and require more explanation. Okay, so chapter 1, very briefly, sets out the scene the background I've just given you, and then it talks about these 4 young men who wound up in Babylon being given a portion of food from the king's table, which they refused to eat. The question is, why? Why would they cause all this trouble? Why would they not just, go along with what they were given? Well, some people have suggested that the problem was that there was wine, and these were young men who were teetotal, so they refused on that basis. Others say, well, maybe it was because there was meat, and of course these young men apparently would be vegetarians. But that just doesn't wash. In chapter 10, verse 3, Daniel makes a specific point of saying, for a particular time period, he refused wine and meat and choice food. Well, listen, if I tell you that I'm going to not eat chocolate during the month of August, what that also tells you is that during July and September, I'm going to eat all the chocolate I can get my hands on. Okay, so quite clearly, Daniel and his friends were in the habit of drinking wine and eating meat. There's nothing in Judaism to say you shouldn't, though of course drinking to excess is condemned. But that's not really a reason. And don't think for 1 minute, please, that Daniel's standards slipped as he got older. As we read through these 6 chapters, you're going to realise that even in old age, Daniel absolutely stuck rock solid firm to his principles. So clearly the wine and the meat are not problems in and of themselves. Well, is the problem that the food was unclean? It wasn't kosher. It wasn't prepared the way a good Jew would expect the food to be prepared. Possibly, except for a couple of problems with that explanation. First of all, by the time they arrived in Babylon, they had been on the journey, marching with the rest of the captives for several weeks. It's a long, long way from Jerusalem up around the Fertile Crescent and down to Babylon, and particularly with a very large group, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and captives and all the rest of it, it would be extremely slow. There were weeks and weeks on the road, and somehow or other they'd survived the journey. Do not think for 1 minute that after the siege of Jerusalem these young men would have come out of the city well equipped, well provisioned, with plenty of food. There would have been very little left. Also, do not think that each evening the army would say, hey guys, go and forage in the surrounding countryside, because of course they wouldn't come back. So they would have had to eat whatever they were given by the army. And there's no mention of any problem with the food there, is there? Similarly, this king's table that's mentioned in chapter 1 is undoubtedly a banquet of some description. And I find it very difficult to imagine the poor old king sitting there while some brawny cook crosses her arms on her chest and says, now, young man, you will eat what you're given or you'll go to bed hungry. Well, of course not. There would have been a spread of dishes on the table. And so if Daniel and his friends didn't like the pork dumplings, all they had to do was wait for the fish course to come around, and they could have eaten with a clear conscience without causing any offence. So I don't think the problem is that the food might have not been kosher. Others suggest the problem was that it was sacrificed to idols. Well, this is a very legitimate objection, except for the same two problems. Once again, whether sacrificed to idols or not in the course of being prepared, they had eaten what they were given for several weeks. And again, this is a banquet of some description, and there's no reason at all why they couldn't just pick and choose and fill up on the falafels and the hummus and the pita bread and the roast vegetables and whatever else was there. Okay, it need not have been a problem for them. Rather, the issue seems to be with the circumstances and the setting in which this meal was offered to them. I do not believe that this was like some children's story picture books present it, where you have these four young men sitting away in their sort of dorm room or whatever at the university, and some poor old servant comes in carrying a tray and presents them the leftovers from the king's table. Rather, I think it's as the picture I've put on the screen in front of you. They were invited into the king's banqueting hall. They were to be his advisors. They needed to learn royal etiquette, so they were invited into the banqueting hall to attend the feast. And that's what Daniel and his friends didn't want to do. You see, there's another feast mentioned in the book of Daniel. It's over in chapter 5. We'll look at it in more detail in a moment. But at this feast, the drinking and the feasting got out of hand, and the king ended up blaspheming the God of heaven, and he was judged for doing that. Daniel was not present at that feast. And the reason he wasn't present at the feast in chapter 5 is because he wasn't present at the feast in chapter 1 or any other pagan feast in between. He made his stand. He realized the same thing the king realized, which is that the people you surround yourself with inevitably influence you and change you. And so he chose from the outset never to surround himself with debauchery and drunkenness and the kind of behaviour that would have gone on at these banquets. When we think of worship, we do not normally think that our behaviour is such a key element of it. We think worship is just something that happens in church at the weekend, but it's our behaviour throughout the week which actually states loud and clear who and what we worship. Moving on to chapter 2. The king has a dream. In his dream he sees an image that might have looked something like this, and of course he's a bit perplexed as to what it all means, and so, to cut a long story short, you can read it for yourself, he calls in Daniel, and Daniel goes and prays about it, and God gives him wisdom to interpret the dream. He goes back to the king. He says, "You, O king, you're the head of gold, but after you will come another kingdom. It'll be somewhat inferior. It'll be a kingdom of silver, and after that will come another kingdom of bronze," and so on all the way down to the end of time. It's a fascinating story. It's amazing that God would give insight like this to a pagan king. But what I want to really draw our attention to is just two short verses. You see, when Daniel received wisdom from God to interpret the dream, this is what he said: "Praise be to the name of God for ever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others." And he carries on in the similar sort of vein. But you'll notice who Daniel worships. It's God. But now contrast that with what happens when Daniel goes to Nebuchadnezzar and explains the dreams. Because Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honour and ordered that an offering, an incense, be presented to him. In other words, forgetting entirely that it was the God of heaven who had both given the dream and interpreted it, Nebuchadnezzar worshipped the messenger. And you know, there's a danger in this for us as Christians. It can happen that some very charismatic leader or a very talented worship leader raises up a church or helps a church to grow tremendously. And the danger is that people who think they're worshipping God, really they're worshipping that charismatic leader or that worship leader. And when that person moves on, the church falls apart. Of course, another way of falling into the same trap is when we become fixated on the type of worship. It has to be this kind of music, and it has to be that version of the Bible, and it has to be these number of songs and so on. We're worshipping the messenger rather than the author of the message. It's a trap we need to be careful not to fall into. Now, moving on to chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar obviously did not like God's version of the future very much, and so he determined to create a massive statue entirely made out of gold. He didn't fancy there being any silver kingdom to follow after him, nor bronze nor anything else. So he made this tremendous statue, and we'll come back and look at those sizes in just a moment. He then ordered that everyone be gathered together at the foot of this 30-metre high statue, and when the music played, they were to bow down and worship the statue, or they would be executed in a particularly gruesome way by being thrown into a brick kiln. I'll explain why I say that in just a moment. It doesn't say that in the text. Well, our 3 heroes, Daniel was absent at that time, but his 3 friends, they refused to worship. They refused to bow down. Doubtless in their minds was one of those 10 commandments given all the way back there at Sinai when God set out the original deal with Israel. Do not make any image, do not bow down to it to worship it. And so they didn't bow down. Well, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter. They were thrown in, and all of a sudden poor old Nebuchadnezzar got the shock of his life, because peering in through these flickering flames, he saw not the 3 men that they'd thrown in, but 4. And the 4th, he said, looked like a son of the gods, which is about as near as a pagan king can get to describing Jesus, the Son of God. What's interesting about this is that it isn't quite what it appears. Let's take first of all these dimensions. I measured myself. I'm a little short of 6 feet tall in old measurements, and a little less than 2 feet across the shoulders. In other words, my dimensions are 3 to 1. But if you look at the proportions of this statue, it's 10 to 1. And what that tells you straight away is that this statue is not all statue. As shown in that image on the screen in front of you, a great deal of the statue's height must actually have been pillar. This was something like Nelson's column, a tall pillar and a little tiny statue on top of it. Well, I mean, I'm sure it was still very impressive and a tremendous amount of gold, but it wasn't 30 metres of golden statue. It was a pillar underneath. And now let me pick out another clue from this. You see, gold melts at a relatively low temperature. If you had a gold melting furnace there somewhere nearby, handy for executing people in, it simply wouldn't have any capacity to be heated 7 times hotter. But bricks, on the other hand, depending on what kind of clay you use and what kind of sand you put into the mix, bricks need to be fired at quite different temperatures. And so I'd put it to you that this fiery furnace described in chapter 3, into which the 3 young men were thrown, was actually a brick kiln. And after it had been raised to a very high temperature to bake some of the bricks and lowered to a lower temperature to bake perhaps less important bricks, it was cooled down still further to melt the gold. And Nebuchadnezzar saw it and said, heat that thing way up to maximum again and throw these men into it. Bricks. In other words, this golden statue was mostly brick. A brick pillar, maybe covered with a thin veneer of gold, and then a golden statue of some kind on top of it. It wasn't even really solid gold. It wasn't as valuable as the description first makes it appear. And that makes me think of a contemporary application of this. You see, our culture is incredibly focused on bowing down to celebrity, whether it's social media influencers or movie stars or musicians or whatever else. We model our lives on, we bow down to, we follow every action of these people as though they were something special. Well, we wouldn't normally think of that social media influencer as being a god that we would bow down to. We wouldn't think of that as being a problem, but it is, because anything which attracts our attention and makes us worship in that way takes our worship away from God. Of course, the truth of the matter is that in the same way that this golden statue turns out to be mostly brick, the lives of celebrities and sports stars and all the rest of them often turn out to be more broken and dysfunctional than almost anyone else in society. And yet there's this tendency to bow down and worship. We need to be cautious as Christians. We need to be really careful where we are directing our worship. Chapter 4, we're looking at the topic of self-worship. Nebuchadnezzar was a very impressive king. I mean, what he accomplished in his lifetime was dramatic. It really was. The size of his kingdom, his military conquests, the building programs, and so on. But he had a problem, which was his ego got a bit out of hand. And so God sent him a dream in which he saw a huge tree. And underneath this tree, all the nations of the earth were sheltered, which was symbolic of his kingdom, you see. And God said, look, watch out, because if you don't humble yourself, if you don't tone down that ego a little bit, this tree's going to be cut down. And you will become insane and you will be banished from your throne. Well, again, Daniel was called in to interpret this dream. And for a little while, perhaps, Nebuchadnezzar took it to heart. But then one day, as he was walking through Babylon, he said, is this not great Babylon that I have built? And God pronounced judgment on him at once, and he became insane. He was banished from his throne, and he roamed the wilds like an animal for 7 years. Now, at the end of 7 years, in the dream, symbolically, the stump was bound with bronze in such a way that it would not rot. And at the end of 7 years, the bronze covering was removed, and the tree was able to regrow and begin to redevelop into a great tree again. Couple of points I want to draw to your attention. First of all, when we think of judgment, we normally think of the end of time. You know, maybe something that happens when Christ returns, and perhaps in our mind is one of the parables from Matthew, the sheep and the goats, or something like that. But I want you to notice how often in Scripture it is that God judges and executes judgment against people at different points in history. For Nebuchadnezzar, judgment was pronounced and was executed during his lifetime. And we're going to see in a moment in the next chapter how that happens for another king as well. The second point I'd like to draw to your attention is the parallels here between what God did with Israel and what God did with his pagan king. You see, after this long cycle that Israel went through of rebelling against God and getting into disaster and coming back to God and being blessed and prospering and round and round and round, God gave them warning after warning after warning, but finally he pronounced judgment against them and he sent them off into exile. But he did so for a very specific time period. 7 tens of years, 70 years they were to be exiled into Babylon for, and then they'd be restored. Now exactly that same pattern happened with Nebuchadnezzar. Warning after warning. When he failed to heed the warning, God passed judgment and executed judgment, and he was to be exiled from his throne for 7 years. There's no point exiling a person for 70 years. After which he would be restored. And it's fascinating to me how often this 7 or 70 comes up over and over again throughout the book of Daniel. Symbolic numbers, symbolic of God's perfection, of God's perfect purposes, of his timing, and so on. Now we might wonder, looking at this story, what this has to do with us in the 21st century. Well, I'd like you to think about social media for a minute. You know, when Facebook first came out, it was a great way for me to keep in contact with my cousins in Australia. And that was mainly what showed up in your feed, and it was about what you'd done or where you'd been and that kind of thing. But over time, these social media platforms have changed, and they have become more and more and more about self-promotion. Look at me, look at what I did, look at what I've bought, look at where I've been, look at what I spent money on. You know, it's got to the point where a person would hardly dare to post a picture on Instagram without fixing their makeup. And that's just the men, never mind the women, okay? We've become obsessive about self-promotion, which is just another way of saying self-worship. We are very much in danger of becoming the same narcissistic wreck as Nebuchadnezzar was. And it's a danger for us as Christians, not just for the general society. So we come to chapter 5. Belshazzar, the next king, throws a great party. As we mentioned earlier, things get a bit out of hand. The feasting's fine, but then the wine drinking gets out of hand. Doubtless some very bad behaviour was witnessed, and it culminates in Belshazzar sending off to the storerooms to have brought out the sacred vessels from the temple of God in Jerusalem, which he filled with wine and handed round and had everyone raise a glass to the pagan gods which they worshipped. And that blasphemy against God caused his direct intervention. The hand of God appeared and wrote on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. You know, again, I would draw your attention to the fact that for Belshazzar, judgment was passed and executed that night. The kingdom fell, the city was taken, he lost his life. Nothing here about waiting till the end of time to be judged. God passed and executed judgment on him that same evening. But here's the sobering thought. You see, you and I have no idea at what point in our lives, in our history, we might be weighed in the scales. Will we be found wanting? And I wonder if it might depend upon what kind of company we're keeping. If, when that moment of judgment comes up, we are abstaining, as did Daniel and his friends, that will doubtless count in our favour. If, on the other hand, we are partying with the pagans in some nightclub somewhere, then I wonder which way that judgment will fall for us. We move on to our final chapter, and we find a very interesting paradigm shift in the story, because there's a new king, Darius. And astonishingly enough, Daniel is promoted. And the reason I say astonishingly is because normally when a new king came in, the first thing they would do is execute, or at the very least exile, everybody who was part of the old regime. I mean, how could you ever trust someone in your kingdom who had previously worked for the old king? I'm just trying to imagine if maybe in the next election in this country the Labour Party wins, and when whoever is Labour leader that week is trying to assemble their cabinet, they look back at Rishi Sunak and they say, well, actually, yeah, you did a really good job, managing the economy, and although you're a Conservative through and through, we'd like you to come and work as part of the Labour government. I mean, can you imagine that? It'd never happen, would it? And yet, Daniel was neither executed nor exiled. In fact, he was promoted. And just as an aside, I think that's what God's blessing is really all about. You see, Daniel did not get to that high position because God worked a miracle. Daniel got to that high position because he worked hard, because he was very capable. He probably put in very long hours as well. But once he was there, God looked after him. And I think the same is probably true for us. We can't just sit back and mess around in school and never do any further study or anything and say, well, why isn't God blessing me? Well, God doesn't work miracles that way. But once we get somewhere in life, once we're good at our job, whatever the job is, doesn't have to be an academic job, of course, whatever we're good at, whatever we do, if we do it well, if we do it to the best of our ability, then God will bless us. And that blessing might mean that when all around us others lose their jobs, we keep ours. Or it might mean that if we lose our job, God will help us find another one very quickly. That's what God's blessing looks like. Well, a new law is about to be passed, but the background to this is quite interesting. You see, two things. First of all, I'm going to sort of elaborate a little bit on this, somewhat fancifully. These people, you see, that were appointed under Daniel, they weren't very keen. It was the first case of institutional racism. They weren't very keen on this exile being over them, and so they started looking for some fault with him. But after searching as they might, trying as they might, they could find nothing that he did wrong. And I wonder if any of us would pass a similar test. What if MI5 or CID and the FBI and everyone else got on the case and they looked for every tweet you've ever twittered and every Facebook post you've ever commented on and every website you've ever visited? Would they come back with the same answer that, we'll never find anything wrong with this guy? Well, I doubt it, but it's certainly a standard we should aspire to. So they could find nothing wrong with Daniel. They went to the king and they said, oh, king, your magnificence, all the rest of it. I'm sure they laid it on thick. And, you are ruler over such a diverse kingdom and we need unity. If this kingdom's really going to grow, we need unity. And there's so many different religions and different cultures and different ideas. We need some way to bring the people together. How would it be, O king, if just for 30 days You pass a law that says that people have to stop worshipping their own gods and worship only you. Well, of course, the king was flattered, and doubtless he thought it would be a great idea to get a bit of unity into his kingdom, and so he passed the law. After which, there was a shift in emphasis. Because up until this point, the temptation for Daniel and his friends has been to do something they didn't want to do. So in chapter 1, the temptation was to party with the other pagans, and they didn't want to do that. In chapter 3, it was to bow down to this image, and they didn't want to do that. But now we see a shift, because for the first time, Daniel is being forbidden to do something he would normally do. He normally prays, facing Jerusalem, prays to God. He's now being forbidden to do that. And it's interesting that the devil uses exactly these same two techniques today. Here in the West, it's mostly about the do. There's a temptation, isn't there, for church people to go to places they shouldn't go and do things they shouldn't do and worship things they shouldn't worship. Okay? But there are parts of the world where the worship of God is forbidden. Do not gather together for worship. Do not form a church. Do not own the scriptures. Do not share your faith with other people. Both of those techniques are still in place today. However, no matter the law, Daniel still prayed towards Jerusalem. And I'd like to draw our attention to that for a moment. You see, Daniel was a resident of Babylon. He couldn't do anything about that. But whilst he was resident in Babylon, he prayed towards Jerusalem. He lived for Jerusalem. And that should really be what each of us as Christians is. We may live in this city or this town, this country, but that doesn't mean that we should focus on what this town, this country does. We should always have our focus towards Jerusalem, metaphorically. It's the first and probably the last time in history that a pagan government attended a prayer meeting. And I wonder what they heard. You see, we know from chapter 9 that Daniel can be very eloquent when he prays. And I'm sure he knew that there were people listening, and I'm sure he gave them a really good sermon in his prayer. He probably prayed for Babylon, because God had told the Israelites to look to the prosperity of the land where they were. He probably prayed for the government. He probably prayed for the people who were about to betray him. And they went running back to Darius and said, "Oh, King, we're terribly sorry to report. We've caught Daniel breaking your law." And Darius was about to discover something very interesting about what it means to be a kingdom of silver. Because unlike Nebuchadnezzar, who did whatever he wanted, good or bad, Darius was only the second highest authority in his own kingdom. You see, it turned out that he was subject to the rule of law. A law passed supposedly for the good of the people. And isn't it interesting how often the laws that are passed that curtail civil liberties are sold to people as being good for society? Oh, well, it'll make the world a better place. Yeah, absolutely. But that law that was passed could not be changed. And so Daniel was arrested and was thrown into a den of lions. The reason why the lions were there, by the way, is that unlike these days where you might go on a pheasant shoot, the Babylonians were keen on lion hunting, and they kept some lions which they would then release and hunt and so on for sport. It's interesting, isn't it? Because of Daniel's faithfulness in chapter 1, he refused to eat. And because of Daniel's faithfulness in chapter 6, the lions refused to eat. And so Daniel survived the night, and in the morning the king very gladly had him drawn out of the dungeon or whatever it was, out of the lion's den, and set free. So we're going to leave Daniel's story for a moment now and wrap things up by going over to the book of Revelation. I'm going to share with you 3 passages from Revelation. First, this one, Revelation 14. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water." In other words, worship God the Creator. But notice this, please. In chapter 13, people worshipped what? The dragon, the devil, because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshipped the beast. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. Well, not quite all. All whose names have not been written in the Lamb's Book of Life. In other words, what we find is that there are two groups of people. It says also the second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. You know, it doesn't matter whether it's the first beast or the second beast or the image to the beast. Behind them all is the dragon. There are only two groups of people, and there are only two things they worship. One group worships God the Creator. The other group, whatever they think they're worshipping, whether it's this beast or that beast or the image or something else, they're worshipping the dragon. And there are only two groups. But when we look at Revelation, it's very tempting to think that this is all just about the future, about the far distant future. This is some event that will happen in the future. But I'd like to draw your attention for a moment to the point that actually this same binary choice, will you worship this or will you worship this? The same question's always been there right since the beginning. Way back there in the first couple of chapters of Genesis, we have the story of Cain and Abel, and what tore them apart and brought about the first murder ever recorded was a dispute over worship. One of the two, Abel, he was willing to worship God the way God wanted him to worship. Cain wasn't prepared to do that, and for reasons which are too complicated to go into right now, Cain tried to worship in a different way. A simple binary choice. Do you worship the way God wants you to, or do you worship the way the dragon wants you to? Abraham. A great deal is said about worship during the lifetime of Abraham. He built altars wherever he went. He worshipped God. And of course, we've already covered the time of the Israelites. We've looked at the story of Daniel. Again, the choices were simple. Do you bow down to this or do you stay faithful to God? Do you party with the pagans or are you abstaining? Do you pray towards Jerusalem or do you refrain? It's a simple binary choice. Will you worship the God who made the heavens and the earth? Or will you worship something else, knowing that whatever it's called in your particular time, in your particular era, what you're really doing is worshipping the devil? That same binary choice has been there always. And so the challenge is for us, whilst everyone around us is happy to bow down to celebrity or whatever other thing comes along, are we as Christians willing to stand up and be counted? Are we willing to worship God rather than engage in the adoration of self through social media? Are we willing to worship God rather than getting caught up in celebrity or sport or any other kind of fascination with other people? Are we willing to pray towards Jerusalem rather than partying with the pagans? You see, one of the things that Jesus brings to our attention in Matthew 24 is that what we do now really affects what we do in the future. Remember, the reason Daniel wasn't at that blasphemous party in chapter 5 was because he refused to attend the party in chapter 1. You see, the issue for us as Christians isn't so much what we might hypothetically do at some hypothetical future time when a hypothetical law is passed, either forcing us to worship one thing or disallowing the worship of something else. That's not really the issue. The issue is today. What will you do today, this evening, Monday morning, Friday evening? What will your life choices be? Where will you be? Who will you be with? And what will you be doing? Will you be worshipping God, or will you be worshipping the alternative?